On a luxurious international flight, a young black girl was assigned to sit next to a wealthy and powerful billionaire. Throughout the flight, he avoided her cold, distant, even asking to switch seats, leaving the girl hurt and confused. But just minutes later, he suddenly suffered a severe heart attack, his face turning pale as he collapsed. Though only 12, the girl instantly reached out to support him and shouted for help. And when he gently grasped her hand, the words he whispered left her frozen. The photograph she would later find in his jacket pocket would uncover a truth she never could have imagined. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow I have something special just for you. The air in the airport terminal was sterile, humming faintly with the low murmur of voices, the occasional screech of luggage wheels, and the polite but practiced voices of attendants calling names over the intercom. Mira stood silently near gate B-17, clutching the handle of a worn suitcase that seemed too big for her small frame. She was 12 years old, traveling alone, and although her sneakers were clean and her coat buttoned all the way up, there was something in her eyes that told of a girl used to holding herself together. The way she watched people not staring, but absorbing, noticing everything, spoke of a childhood where she'd learned to pay attention before speaking. Her brown fingers curled a little tighter around the handle when the gate agent gave her a once-over and then smiled too brightly. "Flying alone, sweetheart?" the woman asked, voice lilting friendly in a rehearsed way. Mira nodded and passed her the boarding pass, saying nothing. She didn't smile. She didn't have the energy for polite pretend games. The agent glanced at the seat first class A1, then back at Mira. There was the briefest flicker of something in her face. Surprise, discomfort. Maybe a question she knew better than to ask aloud. Mira saw it and said nothing. She was used to that look, used to being in spaces where people wondered if she belonged. The agent handed back the pass and gestured her forward. "Have a good flight." Walking down the jet bridge, Mira could feel it. The hush. The weight of a space that cost more than people thought children like her should occupy. She took a slow breath and stepped into the first-class cabin. It smelled like cologne, citrus cleaner, and aged leather. Seats like thrones. Quiet voices. Mira's seat was A1, a window seat with a table built into the armrest. She moved toward it, her small backpack bumping her side with each step. When she reached her row, the man already in seat A2 turned his head. He was older white with silver hair cut neatly above a pressed collar. His posture was perfect, hands folded on his lap. He looked like money, not the flashy kind, but the kind so deep it didn't need to be shown off. The moment he saw Mira, his eyes narrowed just slightly, and then something flickered. It wasn't judgment exactly, not confusion either. It was recognition, or maybe memory, something that passed too quickly to be named. Then it was gone, replaced by the polite blankness that rich people wear like a suit. Mira avoided his eyes and placed her bag in the overhead bin. She sat down quietly, pulling her coat tight, even though the cabin wasn't cold. She could feel his glance again, and this time she turned to meet it. He looked away. A flight attendant approached, blonde red lipstick perfectly composed. "Sir, would you like something to drink before takeoff?" she asked. Actually, the man said, his voice low and smooth. "Is there another available seat somewhere else?" The attendant blinked. "You'd like to move Mr. Bennett?" Mira's ears perked at the name. He nodded slightly. "If possible." The attendant scanned the cabin quickly, then leaned closer. "I'm afraid we're full up front. Would you like me to check in business?" He paused. Mira didn't move. "No," he said finally. "It's fine." The attendant smiled and left. Mira turned her head slowly, not enough to look at him, but just enough to speak. "If you don't want to sit next to a kid, you could have just said so," she muttered, barely audible. He said nothing. A moment passed, then another. "I've sat next to children before," he said, still facing forward. "It's not about that." "What is it about?" she asked. He didn't answer. Mira leaned back and stared out the window. The engines hummed to life as the plane prepared for departure. Her fingers traced the seam of her jeans, slow and deliberate. There was a storm in her chest, quiet but churning. She thought about the woman who had kissed her forehead goodbye that morning, eyes tired but proud. Her grandmother, the only person who had ever stood in both the role of mother and father. Before leaving, she'd pressed a photograph into Mira's coat pocket and whispered, "Don't show it until you have to." Mira hadn't looked at it yet. The plane taxied. Safety announcements played. Mira tuned them out. Her eyes lingered on the reflection in the window, her own face next to the faint outline of the man beside her. There was something odd about how still he sat, how his hands didn't fidget, how his gaze was fixed straight ahead, as if trying not to see something that had already seen him. As the plane lifted into the sky, Mira felt the shift in pressure deep in her ears and her chest. Still, she sat rigid, feeling the tension from the man beside her like static in the air. She didn't know why he looked at her like that. She didn't know why his jaw tightened every time she moved. But she felt something familiar in it, a discomfort she'd seen before in strangers who thought her presence was an interruption. She was used to being the reminder of something people didn't want to remember. But there was something else in his eyes. Something different, like maybe he wasn't looking at her as a stranger at all. The hum of the aircraft had settled into a steady drone, the kind that wraps around your head like a too warm blanket. Mira sat upright in her seat, her arms folded across her stomach, her gaze fixed forward, though her eyes didn't seem to focus on anything. Across the aisle, someone coughed. The man beside her, Alistair Bennett, though she didn't yet know the weight of that name, remained unnervingly quiet. He hadn't spoken since takeoff, and while Mira had expected silence from a stranger, his silence felt personal, almost purposeful. Every so often, he shifted slightly, straightening a cuff, adjusting his seatbelt, clearing his throat. These weren't idle movements. They felt like distractions, little acts of self-control to mask something stirring. Just beneath his polished exterior, Mira noticed everything. The flight attendant came by with drinks her smile, the kind that looked like it had been painted on in haste. Alistair requested sparkling water, his voice low and firm with a practiced politeness. Mira declined. She wasn't thirsty. Not for soda, not for orange juice. What she craved, though she couldn't yet name it, was an answer, something to explain the way the man next to her flinched when she sat down, or why he had asked in a voice too measured if he could be moved to another seat. And now he was sitting perfectly still, not reading, not sleeping, just existing in that seat like a statue while she tried to make sense of her own unease. He turned slightly, not enough to face her, but just enough to speak without meeting her eyes. "Do you travel often?" he asked. The words felt sudden, like he had debated breaking the silence for some time. Mira looked at him, blinked once, then turned her head slightly. "I go where I'm told," she said. There was no sharpness in her voice, but there was no warmth either. He gave a slow nod, like he understood something in her tone, though she wasn't sure he really did. A pause followed heavier than necessary. She added more to the window than to him. "I'm used to long rides, planes, trains, greyhounds." He didn't respond, not right away. Then, "That's a lot of moving for someone your age." Mira's jaw tightened slightly. "So is silence," she murmured, then closed her eyes. She didn't need his concern, and certainly not his sympathy. But the way he shifted in his seat again told her he wasn't offering either. He was uncomfortable, not with her specifically, but with the feeling of being near her. That difference mattered. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft climbed higher. Flight attendants moved like shadows, collecting empty cups and offering meals wrapped in plastic trays. Mira accepted hers and ate in silence. She noticed Alistair didn't touch his food. Instead, he unbuttoned his jacket slowly and draped it neatly over his lap. That's when she saw it, a small edge of white paper peeking from the inside pocket, just barely visible. For a second, it looked like a folded brochure or maybe an old ticket stub. But then his hand brushed against it accidentally, and the paper slipped free, fluttering down like a feather caught in a draft. It landed near her foot. She glanced at him. His eyes were closed or pretending to be. Mira reached down and picked up the slip of paper. It wasn't a ticket. It was a photograph. Her fingers froze around it before she even turned it over. Something inside told her to stop, but she didn't. The photo showed a woman, her mother Lena, standing beside a much younger Alistair Bennett. There was no mistaking it. Her mother's eyes were bright, her smile warm and unguarded in a way Mira had never seen in real life. And Alistair, he looked at Lena with something unmistakable in his posture, his proximity, the way his hand rested on the small of her back. It was not a picture you carried of a colleague, not a casual acquaintance. This was intimate. This was history. Mira's chest tightened. Her breath slowed. She looked again to the man beside her who had not opened his eyes, and for the first time in the entire flight, she felt something more than suspicion. She felt anger. Her mother had always been vague about the past. Mira had grown up with more questions than answers, but never, not once, had her mother mentioned this man. And now he sat here next to her pretending she was just another passenger. She turned the photograph over. There was no date, no note, no clue written on the back. Just the image. Just enough to set her world spinning. Mira folded the photo carefully and slipped it into the book on her lap. She didn't return it. She didn't even think about doing so. If he wanted it, he'd have to admit it was his. She doubted he would. The rest of the flight passed in a different kind of silence, one that crackled. Mira didn't speak again. Neither did Alistair. Occasionally he opened his eyes and glanced around, perhaps wondering if the photo had fallen out. But he never asked. He never looked at her directly again. As the plane began its descent, Mira sat straighter, her fingers pressed lightly against the cover of her book where the photo now lived. The quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt charged, like something was about to shift. And it would. She would make sure of it. Because whoever this man was to her mother, whatever he had done or not done, he was no longer a stranger. Not really. Not anymore. The descent began, gently signaled by the soft ding of the cabin lights and a change in the engine's tone. Mira felt the pressure shift in her ears, but she didn't reach for gum or swallow hard like she normally might have. Her mind wasn't on the descent. It was circling around the folded photograph tucked tightly in her book, burning through her awareness like it had a pulse of its own. She had looked at it twice now, just to make sure her eyes hadn't played tricks on her. Each time the image of her mother smiling beside Alistair Bennett stared back at her with unwavering clarity. That smile, wide, relaxed, full of a happiness Mira had never seen in real life, felt both familiar and distant, like it belonged to a different woman in a different time. The man beside her mother in the photo, so much younger, yet unmistakably the man now seated next to her, had his hand resting gently on her mother's back, a gesture of intimacy no one could fake. The implication was clear, and yet the silence between them had only grown colder. Alistair hadn't acknowledged the missing photo. If he had noticed its absence, he didn't show it. He remained composed, stoic, even as though willing himself to blend into the seat. His eyes stayed mostly closed, his hand still folded over the jacket on his lap. Mira, on the other hand, couldn't keep still. Her legs didn't twitch and she didn't fidget outwardly, but her thoughts raced so fast that her body tensed as if bracing for impact. Every breath she took felt shallower than the last. Her hand gripped the book with the photo inside as though it might fly away. She glanced over at him again, not because she expected answers now, but because she had to see if he felt it too, that moment, that undeniable bond neither of them had spoken of. But he gave her nothing. Then, without warning, he moved. It was subtle at first, a small shift in posture, a hand drifting to his chest, fingers pressing slightly against the fabric of his shirt. Mira caught it in her peripheral vision and turned just as he drew in a sharp breath. His shoulders tensed. His face, still composed a second earlier, began to strain with effort. His jaw clenched. Another breath, this one shorter, caught halfway up his throat. His eyes opened but did not focus. Mira sat forward quickly, every part of her going still, except her eyes, which darted across his face. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly but firmly. There was no response. Just another breath, this one shakier, followed by a quiet groan that seemed to escape without his permission. Alistair's hand now gripped the armrest, knuckles white, the other still clutched at his chest. Something was wrong. Mira didn't hesitate. She looked to the aisle, but the flight attendants were in the galley, unseen. She reached across and touched his shoulder, shaking gently. "Sir, can you hear me?" His lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, an expression of pain and panic, and something else flickered across his face, and then his eyelids fluttered. The strength seemed to drain from his neck, and he slumped to the side, body leaning toward her. Mira stood halfway from her seat, trying to keep her voice steady. "Help! Somebody help!" She called loud enough for the rows behind them to turn. A flight attendant came rushing forward, face drawn tight with concern. Mira pointed to Alistair. "He's having a heart attack. I think he can't breathe. He's holding his chest." The flight attendant knelt down immediately, pressing 2 fingers to Alistair's neck, calling over her shoulder for the emergency kit. A male passenger, mid-40s, in a worn denim jacket, stood and came forward. "I'm a paramedic," he said quickly, his voice firm. "Let me through." Mira stepped back but didn't sit. Her legs felt weak, but she needed to see what was happening, needed to be there. The paramedic laid Alistair down flat across the row of seats, loosened his collar, and pulled open the shirt slightly. His chest was heaving unevenly. They attached oxygen. The defibrillator was unwrapped, prepped. Instructions were being followed. People were watching. but Mira saw only him. Somewhere in that chaos, Alistair reached up weakly, his hand trembling. Mira saw it out of the corner of her eye and moved closer. She crouched beside the seat, and his fingers brushed hers. The touch was faint, barely there, but it made her freeze. He looked at her truly, looked at her for the first time, and there was no blankness in that gaze. There was only fear and regret and urgency. His lips parted. "Ah, your mother." It came out as a breath, more air than voice, and then he closed his eyes again. Mira leaned closer. "What? What about my mother?" she whispered, but there was no answer. His mouth stopped moving. The hand that had reached for hers fell to his chest. The paramedic started chest compressions. Mira stood back. The flight attendant guided her to the side gently, and she didn't resist. She sat slowly back in her seat, eyes wide and unblinking. She didn't cry. She didn't even breathe deeply. She just watched as strangers tried to save a man she had only known as a stranger until 20 minutes ago, but now couldn't pretend was just that anymore. That one whispered phrase, those 2 words confirmed what she already suspected. He had known her mother. Intimately, deeply enough to carry a photograph after all these years, deeply enough to try to say something before it was too late. The plane continued its descent, but Mira felt as though time had slowed down. The movements of the crew were precise. The lights seemed too bright. Her book sat in her lap, closed tightly, hiding the picture that had pulled her world apart. She opened it again slowly, staring once more at the image her mother Alistair, the way they looked at each other. Then she looked up at the man now lying unconscious under a breathing mask. A flight attendant approached her quietly. "Honey, are you with him? Are you family?" Mira looked up, eyes still wide, then turned them back to the man who had never once called her by name. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The question was simple. The answer was not. Finally, she said, "I don't know." The wheels touched down with a low, grinding hum, and the cabin jolted forward in one unified pull, but Mira barely noticed. Her body was buckled in, but her mind was still back in the air, watching Alistair's lips move without sound, hearing him whisper the words that made everything heavier. She didn't remember collecting her bag or walking down the jet bridge, only the blur of people parting to let the paramedics rush through. Somehow, she ended up in the back of the ambulance, silent arms tight around the book that held the photo like it was something fragile she couldn't let go. The siren echoed faintly against the city skyline as they weaved through early evening traffic. She stared through the small back window, not blinking, not speaking. When the doors finally opened at the emergency entrance, she stepped down slowly, her legs stiff, her heart louder than the noise around her. The bright lights of the hospital lobby made her squint. The air smelled sharp antiseptic and too clean. She followed behind without being asked. No one questioned her, not yet. But the moment wouldn't last. They wheeled him away quickly, disappearing behind double doors marked trauma, while Mira stood just outside the restricted area, unsure of what to do or say. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. She hadn't even noticed. A nurse with tightly pulled back blonde hair approached her clipboard in hand. A soft smile stretched over tight lips. "Are you family?" The woman asked, her tone polite but distant. Mira hesitated. The question was familiar, and once again she wasn't sure how to answer it. Finally, she offered a quiet, "I was with him." The nurse's eyes flicked briefly to her dark complexion, then back to her paperwork. "Have a seat in the waiting area," she said, and pointed toward a small row of vinyl chairs along the far wall. Mira obeyed. Time blurred again. People came and went. Occasionally a nurse would walk by, glance in her direction, then continue on without a word. At some point a man entered through a side hallway. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed gray suit with a matching tie and polished shoes that clicked sharply against the tile floor. His hair was a silvery white, combed back neatly. His walk was purposeful, practiced. When he stopped in front of her and said her name without question, Mira knew immediately that he was not from the hospital. "Miss Mira Gaines?" he asked. She looked up. His voice was low, controlled. He didn't offer his hand. "My name is Mr. Halford. I represent Mr. Bennett's estate. I understand you were on the flight with him." She nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. Mr. Halford didn't sit. He remained standing, a wall of presence, looking down at her. "Do you have any idea why he was traveling today?" She shook her head. "I don't," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He studied her face, and she saw it in his eyes, a pause, a calculation. He continued, There's no record of you among Mr. Bennett's family or known associates. Can you explain your relationship with him?" Mira sat upright. Her throat felt dry, but she met his gaze. "He knew my mother," she said simply. "Her name was Lena Gaines." That name landed like a pebble in still water. Mr. Halford blinked once slowly, and for a moment his expression shifted just briefly before snapping back into neutrality. "I see," he said. There was a pause, then he added, "I'm sorry, Miss Gaines, but there's no documentation, no acknowledgement of any child related to Mr. Bennett, especially not from that background." He didn't say neighborhood. He didn't say race. But the pause, the weight behind the word was unmistakable. Mira heard it, felt it. "He carried a photo of her," Mira said, her voice steadying. "Of my mother. Until the end." Mr. Halford's eyes narrowed. "That photo has been secured by our legal team," he replied flatly. "It's part of the estate." Her chest tightened, her hands balled into fists. "He was trying to say something when he collapsed," she insisted. "He reached for me. He said your mother. He was going to tell me something." Mr. Halford's voice remained smooth. "That's unfortunate, but unless he left something in writing officially, you understand the estate must proceed within the bounds of legal clarity." A nurse approached, then younger, with dark curly hair and a kind face. She spoke softly. "Excuse me, are you Miss Gaines?" Mira turned. The nurse continued. "I was with him in the trauma room before he passed. He held on to a photo, wouldn't let go. We had to take it from his hand. He kept whispering Lena. That name meant something to him." Mira's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. The young nurse touched her shoulder gently, then walked away. Mr. Halford cleared his throat. "Regardless, the hospital will be releasing the body to the family. That doesn't include you. I would recommend returning home." She stood slowly, the photo still in her bag, the weight of it now heavier than ever. She didn't speak, didn't argue, but as she walked out of the hospital, past the glass doors and into the chill of the late afternoon air, she made a silent promise not to be erased. Not again. That night, Mira couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table of her mother's old apartment, the one she'd been sent, now hers, with the overhead light dimmed low, casting long shadows across the linoleum. The book was still in her hands, the one Alistair had carried, the one that held the photo like a buried truth, and she ran her thumb along its cracked spine. Tucked deep between the last few pages behind the photograph was a folded sheet of paper she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't official, not typed or sealed, just a small note in faded ink. Her breath slowed as she unfolded it carefully. Asterisk, Lena back entrance. Thursday mornings, Hidden Grove. Asterisk. There was no date, no full address, but Mira knew. Hidden Grove. That name, her mother had whispered it once, maybe twice, when Mira was too young to understand what a place could take from someone. Back then, when she had asked her mother where she used to work, Lena had only muttered, asterisk, that house wasn't ours. Asterisk. Now holding that note, Mira felt the room tilt as if the story she'd been chasing had suddenly stood up in front of her. She didn't need more proof. She knew where she had to go. The morning after the hospital, Mira stood at the edge of the wrought iron gate, staring through the bars at the house that once loomed only in her mother's quiet memories. It was just past 7, the light pale and clean, and the hedges that lined the circular driveway had been trimmed to perfection. The gate hadn't changed since her mother had first described it, tall, black, and cold to the touch, like it had been designed to keep people out more than let them in. She didn't press the buzzer right away. Her hands rested at her sides, the same way her mother used to stand in church, still composed eyes locked forward, but never revealing what trembled inside. Mira's chest felt tight. This wasn't her world, not by blood, not by welcome, but she had come anyway. She pushed the call button. A few seconds passed, and a small crackle of static broke through the intercom. Yes. The voice was dry, female, elderly. Mira spoke clearly. My name is Mira Gaines. I'm here. I just wanted to see the house. My mother used to work here. Her name was Lena. There was silence. A long, unmistakable silence, as if the person on the other end had just heard a ghost knock at the door. Then the buzz sounded and the gate unlatched. She pushed it open slowly. The gravel under her feet shifted with every step as she made her way up the drive. The house itself stood tall and wide, painted in pale gray stone, its windows stretched high and proud like they were meant to look down on everyone who passed through. Mira stopped at the front steps, hesitating only when the door opened before she could knock. A woman stood there, thin, upright, wearing a long navy sweater and flat shoes. Her hair was white, her eyes small and sharp behind metal-rimmed glasses. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the woman nodded once. "You said your mother was Lena." It wasn't a question. Mira nodded. The woman opened the door wider. "I remember her. Come in." The entrance hall smelled like lemon polish and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to tradition and never leaves. Mira stepped onto the marble floor, her shoes making barely a sound. The walls were lined with framed photos, portraits of men in suits, women in pearls, a family frozen in time, always well-dressed, always composed. The house was quiet, not in a peaceful way, but in the way museums are silent, but watching. The woman walked ahead without looking back. "I'm Mrs. Holt. I was the housekeeper. I still come in now and then. They haven't found anyone else." She led Mira into a side room off the hallway. It was a small sitting area, bright with tall windows. A tea service had already been set on a tray near the table, untouched. "She used to dust this room every Thursday," Mrs. Holt said almost to herself. "Never missed a corner." Mira sat on the edge of the couch, her back straight. She looked around slowly. Everything felt too clean, too curated, the kind of place where stories were buried under polish. "Did she ever speak much?" Mira asked. Mrs. Holt tilted her head slightly. "Lena, no. Not to us. Not unless she had to. But I remember, once I found her in the pantry, crying, quietly. She didn't know I was there. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place." Mira clenched her jaw. "She never told me anything about this place, just that she left and never wanted to come back." Mrs. Holt's eyes softened. She had reason. She poured herself a cup of tea, but didn't offer one to Mira, not out of cruelty, but perhaps out of old habit or discomfort. Mira didn't ask. After a moment, Mrs. Holt rose and gestured toward the hallway. "If you want to look around, go ahead. I have work to do in the back." Mira stood and nodded, murmured a quiet thank you, and stepped out alone. She walked slowly through the corridors. The dining room was dark wood, long and heavy, with a table that could seat 20. She imagined her mother moving silently around it, refilling glasses, clearing plates never spoken to, unless something was missed. A faded stain remained in the corner of the carpet wine, maybe. Mira imagined Lena on her knees, scrubbing it under someone's cold stare. She moved down the hall to the back staircase. Her fingers trailed along the rail, and she paused at a small room just off the kitchen. The door creaked when she opened it. Inside was a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a small mirror. No windows. This was where the staff stayed, where her mother had slept. She stepped inside. The air was still. On the dresser, she noticed a small square tin box, the kind used for sewing needles or keepsakes. It looked untouched for years. She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was her mother's. "He said it was never to be spoken of. He said it would ruin them all. But I saw the way he looked at her, like she was more than a secret. I was never supposed to matter. But she did." Mira closed the box. Her hands were trembling. She felt it then, not just grief or confusion, but a deep rising certainty that her being there wasn't a mistake. That this house, with all its silence, owed her answers. And maybe, just maybe, part of its truth had been buried with her mother's silence. A voice startled her from the doorway. "Who let you in here?" Mira turned sharply. A woman in her 40s, dressed in tailored black slacks and a silk blouse, stood with arms crossed. Her eyes were hard, mouth tight. "This is a private home. You don't belong here." Mira stepped back into the light. "My name is Mira Gaines. My mother worked here." The woman didn't move. "That doesn't give you the right to walk through people's rooms." Mira held her ground. She lived in this room. That's not just a place, it's her life. The woman's expression twisted slightly. "If you think this house owes you something because your mother scrubbed floors here 30 years ago, you're mistaken." Mira felt her heart pounding. Her fingers tightened around the tin box. She didn't raise her voice. "I'm not asking for anything." The woman scoffed, turned, and walked away. Mira stood there for a long moment, her eyes drifting to the ceiling. Then she exhaled, slowly, and walked out, box in hand. Outside, the sky had darkened. The wind had picked up slightly, and the leaves rustled against the trimmed hedges. Mira looked back at the house one last time. Every step she took away from it felt different than the steps that had brought her in. This time, she wasn't just the daughter of someone forgotten. She was someone who remembered, and she wasn't done. The apartment was quiet when Mira returned. The hallway lights buzzed softly, casting their amber glow across the cracked paint and worn carpet. She shut the door behind her, slower than usual, as if the weight of what she carried needed permission to cross the threshold. In her hands, she held the tin box, small, light, but dense with everything she could no longer ignore. She set it down on the kitchen counter, her keys beside it with a soft clink, and leaned against the counter edge, breathing shallowly. The apartment hadn't changed since her mother passed. The framed picture above the dining table was still slightly crooked. The refrigerator still had a faded magnet that read, "Breathe." Mira moved to the living room and sat down on the floor in front of the coffee table, crossing her legs like she used to as a child. On the table was the book Alistair had carried, the one that had started this whole unraveling. She reached for it, slowly opened the last few pages again, and looked at the note she'd already memorized. Lena, back entrance, Thursday mornings, Hidden Grove, asterisk. That address had taken her to a place her mother had never wanted to return to, but it had spoken volumes in silence. She took the tin box and opened it again. The note inside was simple, one paragraph, but Mira read it 5 times before setting it down. He said it was never to be spoken of. He said it would ruin them all. But I saw the way he looked at her, like she was more than a secret. I was never supposed to matter. But she did. Asterisk. The way Lena had written those words, firm but trembling strong, but edged with sorrow, it felt like she had been writing them in a whisper, fearful of who might hear, but more afraid of being forgotten. Mira stood up and moved to the bookshelf where her mother kept a row of recipe books and a few odd documents. She ran her fingers across the spine, stopping at a narrow green binder tucked at the end, partially hidden by a phone directory. She pulled it free and opened it on the kitchen table. Inside were tax forms, insurance statements, pay stubs from decades ago, many from jobs Mira never knew her mother held. One in particular caught her eye. The header read, Bennett Residence, Domestic Staff Payment Ledger, asterisk. Her mother had made $12 an hour back then. Mira blinked slowly. That was less than she'd made in her first job at a bookstore. She flipped the pages carefully, looking for anything else that mentioned the Bennett house. Near the back, on a loosely attached page, she found a signed letter, short curt on cheap paper, asterisk. To whom it may concern, I resign from my post effective immediately. I am unable to continue due to health concerns and unsafe working conditions. Asterisk. It was dated only 2 days after Mira's birth. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just a resignation. It was a severance from something deeper, a final step in a life that had already demanded silence. She leaned against the table, her fingers curled around the edge. Why had her mother stayed quiet all those years? Why hadn't she told her about that house, that man, the way they intersected? But the answer already lived in the notes, the resignation, the hidden box. Lena had never been allowed to matter, not loudly, not legally, not publicly. And the one time she had dared to exist in someone's eyes, she had been buried under shame and expectation. Mira stared out the kitchen window. The sky was turning that early evening blue, the kind that softened rooftops and made even the sharpest corners look forgiving. But there was no forgiveness in her chest, only clarity. She moved back to the coffee table, pulled her laptop from under it, and opened a browser. She searched for archival databases, employee records, even old news clippings. There was nothing directly linking Lena Gaines to the Bennett estate online, but she wasn't surprised. That kind of connection wasn't meant to be public. That's what her mother had been running from, and what the Bennetts had been hiding. She stood up again, restless, and walked into the bedroom, her mother's room. Still barely changed. Mira sat at the edge of the bed and looked at the nightstand drawer. She hadn't opened it in months. She reached for the handle and pulled. Inside was a small black notebook, some receipts, and a pair of glasses. She took the notebook. Inside, written in precise small script, were grocery lists, prayer notes, and a line near the back that read, Keep the box sealed. If she ever asks, tell her the truth gently. Asterisk. Mira closed her eyes. Her mother had never gotten the chance to explain. The truth had waited in silence instead for years until Mira had pulled it out herself. Her phone buzzed, a reminder for a calendar event she had forgotten to cancel. She dismissed it and opened her contacts. Her thumb hovered, then scrolled down to Halford's number. He had left her his card. She tapped the call icon. The phone rang twice. This is Halford. His voice was as steady as she remembered. It's Mira Gaines. Her voice didn't waver. Miss Gaines. I didn't expect to hear from you again." She breathed in deeply. "I think it's time we talked again, about my mother, about what happened, and about what comes next." There was a pause. Then, "I'll make time. When can you come in?" Tomorrow, noon." "Noted." She hung up. The phone felt heavier in her hand than it should, but the weight wasn't fear. It was purpose. She walked back into the kitchen, picked up the tin box, and held it tight to her chest. It wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about everything that silence had allowed to go unchallenged. It was about her mother, yes, but it was also about who Mira had become and what she was no longer willing to ignore. The wind stung Mira's face as she sat in the back seat of Ruby's car, clutching a book she wasn't really reading. The sky outside was gray, pressed low against the London skyline. They were parked just outside the building where Mira had been before Halford and Longworth. Ruby had promised it would be quick. She just needed to talk to someone. But Mira had been here long enough to know that nothing was ever quick when adults said it would be. Ruby's footsteps echoed as she climbed the stone steps and disappeared inside. Mira leaned her head against the cold window. She could see her own reflection, the quiet frustration in her eyes, the faint crease in her brow that seemed to have deepened in recent days. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for anymore, but she knew one thing: people were hiding things from her. Her mother's name whispered behind doors, her own presence treated like a mystery everyone else had already solved. And then there was Alistair, the man who had died before she could ask him anything, and yet everyone seemed to have an opinion about him, about what he meant to her. Time passed. Ruby was still inside. Mira opened the car door and stepped out, her boots crunching lightly on the gravel. She knew it wasn't allowed, but she also knew nobody would stop a quiet girl just wandering around. She slipped inside the building and took the elevator to the third floor. The hallway was empty. The same receptionist was no longer at her desk. She kept her steps quiet. When she reached Halford's office, she saw that the door wasn't fully closed. Voices floated out, muffled but distinct. Mira hesitated for a second, then crept closer, staying just around the corner where the wall dipped. Inside, Halford was speaking to a woman Mira didn't recognize. The woman's voice was clipped, impatient. "We should have destroyed the documents years ago," the woman said. "If she finds them," Halford interrupted, his voice low. "I told you Alistair made me keep them, for legal continuity. He knew she might come looking. And now she's here. What do we do?" "Nothing. We wait. She's 12. She doesn't even know what she's looking at. And by the time she figures it out, it'll be too late." Mira's heart pounded in her chest. She took a small step back, her boot tapping the wooden floor. The sound echoed. Inside, the conversation stopped. She turned and moved quickly, not running, but with the urgency of someone who suddenly realized she wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this place. She made it back to the elevator just as it opened. Ruby stepped out, surprised. "Mira, what are you doing here?" "I was just cold in the car," she mumbled. Ruby didn't press, but her eyes narrowed slightly, like she sensed more beneath the surface. Later that evening, back at the flat, Ruby tucked Mira into the small guest bed. But Mira didn't fall asleep. She stared at the ceiling, then rolled onto her side, facing the wall. "Ruby," she whispered. Ruby looked up from her chair. "Did you know my mom used to work for them, the Bennetts?" Ruby set the book in her lap down slowly. "Where did you hear that?" "I saw her name, in their building, and I heard them talking. About hiding something. About me." Ruby walked over and sat gently on the edge of the bed. Her voice was careful. "Mira, why didn't you say anything before?" "Because I thought maybe it would go away. But it doesn't. It's everywhere." Ruby nodded. Her hand rested softly on Mira's blanket. "Then we start finding out. One piece at a time. Not just you. We'll do it together." The next morning, Ruby made a call. Not to Halford, but to someone she trusted. Someone who might know more. While Ruby worked quietly in the other room, Mira sat at the kitchen table drawing lines between names on a scrap of paper. Her mother, Alistair, Halford, her own name. She drew a circle around the last one. She didn't know all the answers yet, but for the first time she felt like the questions belonged to her. And no one could take that away. Her name wasn't a mystery. It was Mira Gaines. It started quietly. The kind of quiet that makes you hold your breath, unsure if the next moment will explode or fade away. Mira sat on the edge of her bed, the envelope of documents spread before her like puzzle pieces. Her fingers grazed the worn edges of the paper eyes, tracing the handwriting she now knew belonged to the man the world called Alistair Bennett. She whispered the sentence to herself again, barely audible, as if the room might answer back. "Don't tell her I'm her father. Just make sure she gets here." It was the kind of line that didn't need interpretation. It was cowardice and care wrapped in the same breath. It was a goodbye from someone who never said hello. Freeman worked fast. By Wednesday morning, the article was live. Published in a digital column she still maintained despite her retirement, the piece didn't sensationalize. It was structured like a statement to history. It laid out facts, dates, transactions. It told the story of a housekeeper named Lena who worked at the Bennett estate in Hampshire for over a decade. It noted her absence from any public record or obituary. Then it introduced the name Mira, age 12, born in the U.S., sent to London under the quiet authorization of Alastair himself. It asked no questions. It left none unanswered. Mira didn't expect the world to notice, but it did. Within hours, comments began to appear. At first, they were cautious. A few readers called it fabricated. Others claimed it was a desperate attempt for money. But more voices began to rise. One by one, other stories were shared. From former staff members, from nannies, from gardeners who had long retired. People remembered Lena. They remembered how she was always quiet, how she was never invited to holiday parties, how no family photos ever included her, though she lived under the same roof. One woman, Dolores, claimed she was let go from her job for asking why Lena had disappeared so suddenly. Freeman forwarded everything to Mira. She read each email slowly, some twice, some 3 times. It felt surreal to know her mother was remembered by others, that she had been seen. On Friday afternoon, Mira received a call from Freeman. "You need to see this," she said. "Check the Bennett family page. They just issued a statement." Mira opened the page. The words were clinical. "The Bennett family wishes to express their continued respect for all staff members, past and present. While recent publications have suggested connections that are speculative and unsubstantiated, the family stands by its legacy and values of privacy." Mira felt the heat rise in her chest. Speculative, unsubstantiated. Her existence was being filed under rumor. She called Freeman back. "I want to say something. Not a rant, not a rebuttal, just truth." Freeman hesitated. "You sure? Once your face is out there, it won't be easy to pull back. They already questioned if I'm real. Let them see me." The next morning, Freeman set up a simple recording in her living room. No makeup, no studio, just Mira sitting on a faded blue armchair, her small hands folded in her lap. "My name is Mira. I am 12 years old. My mother was Lena James. She worked for the Bennett family until I was born. We lived together in Georgia. She never talked about the people she worked for. I only learned last year that the man who wrote that note was Alastair Bennett. He was my father. I'm not looking for money. I'm not looking for revenge. I just want people to know that my mother existed, that she mattered." The video lasted 90 seconds. It was viewed over 400,000 times in the first day. The impact was immediate. More emails poured in. One included photos, a holiday dinner from 15 years ago. In the background, barely visible, Lena carried a tray of drinks. Her face turned slightly toward the camera, not smiling. Another came from a woman named Judith, who had worked as a cook. She wrote, "Lena used to hum while she cleaned. Gospel songs. I remember she had a beautiful voice. We all knew something was going on with Alastair, but no one talked about it." For the first time in her life, Mira felt the weight of something larger than her story. This wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about all the stories that never made it to paper because the people who lived them didn't own pens. Freeman called again on Monday. A firm in Bristol civil rights attorneys reached out. They want to talk about a legal pathway. Mira sat at her kitchen table. She didn't answer right away. "Do they want to sue?" "Not unless you do. They want to help establish legal acknowledgement, birthright, historical correction." Mira nodded slowly. She could feel the shift, no longer chasing ghosts, now correcting the record. She thought of something Halford once said, "You have to be prepared for what it might change." It had already changed everything. By Thursday, the Bennetts issued a second statement, this time more carefully worded. They acknowledged the relationship between Alastair and Lena without using the word love or even naming Mira directly, but they called her a young individual deserving of empathy and truth. Freeman showed it to her. "They're bending, not breaking, but bending." Mira folded the page. She didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed just slightly. At night, she sat by the window, staring at the orange glow of city lights. She thought about what her mother would say if she were here. Maybe she'd tell her to be careful. Maybe she'd say this wasn't necessary. but Mira hoped deep down that she would also say she was proud. She whispered to the silence, "I'm not done yet." Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, Mira's story was no longer hidden. It was living, and it wasn't going back in the envelope. The Bennett estate had not hosted a family gathering this tense in years. No champagne was served. No speeches were made. The drawing room, typically used for holiday photos or hushed board decisions, now carried a heaviness in the air that no amount of fresh-cut flowers could mask. Around the long walnut table sat 8 people, all blood or marriage bound to the name Bennett. Some had flown in overnight. Others had been waiting for this moment, dressed in polished restraint, pretending the foundation wasn't cracking beneath them. The oldest Charles Bennett brother to the late Alistair cleared his throat first. His voice, dry and restrained, set the tone. "We are not here to entertain rumors," he said. "We are here to protect this family." No one clapped. The youngest among them, Madeline Alistair's niece, shifted in her seat. Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing yet. Across the table, Anthony, a longtime board member of the Bennett Foundation and married into the family, exhaled sharply. "Rumors," he repeated, tone laced with disdain. "Is that what we're calling it now? A girl with Alistair's face, a note with his handwriting, an entire paper trail, and we're calling it hearsay. What would you have us do?" Margaret snapped, her voice rising not with emotion, but with habit. She had mastered the art of controlled indignation. "Throw open the gates. Invite the press in for tea. This isn't some courtroom drama." Madeline finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but every syllable landed with precision. "She's 12, not a journalist, not a lawyer, just a child trying to understand who she is." "She's a threat," muttered Charles, "and children can be leveraged. We all know how quickly the court of public opinion swings." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Eyes darted, fingers tapped on notepads. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the windows as if listening. From a side hallway, Halford stood just beyond view. He was not invited into the main conversation, but had been asked to remain available. A professional shadow, the kind who knew more than he ever said, and said less than he ever thought. He adjusted his cufflinks, checked his phone, and waited. Back inside, Anthony leaned forward. "You can't put this back in the box. The story's out. Freeman didn't invent this. She only documented it. And now the girl has a face, a name, and a following. If we don't engage with honesty, this won't go away. It will rot from the inside." "This family has survived worse," Charles growled. "We did not crumble in '89 when the markets collapsed. We did not fold when Caroline left. We sure as hell won't bend to the accusations of a girl raised God knows where by a woman who refused to play by the rules." "She cleaned your house," Madeline whispered. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "She raised your brother's child, and you let her disappear." No one answered. Outside, Mira watched from a distance, not from the hedges or gates, but through the filtered lens of information. Freeman had contacts who knew staff who owed favors. She hadn't asked for a transcript of the meeting, but pieces had trickled in like drops from a leaky faucet, just enough to piece together tone and motive. She sat at Freeman's kitchen table, legs crossed, eyes locked on the laptop screen. "So," she said slowly, carefully, "they think I want to tear them down." Freeman didn't reply right away. She was stirring her tea. Mira watched the spoon circle the ceramic bowl, rhythmic and distracted. "It's fear," Freeman finally said. "They fear change more than they fear lies. But I don't want anything from them. That might be what scares them most." Mira wrote that night. Not a public post, not a video, just a private journal entry that started as a letter she never intended to send. "You don't know me. You probably never wanted to, but I exist, and I see you. I don't want your fortune, your name, or your apologies. I just want the truth to matter more than silence." She closed the journal and climbed into bed. The next morning, her inbox pinged. A message from someone named Rosalie Dean, a partner at a small but fierce legal firm specializing in historical inheritance and disenfranchisement cases. Her message was simple. "We've been following your story. There is a clause in the will, sealed, but if challenged with precedent, we might be able to open it. Happy to talk. No charge." Mira stared at the screen. Her heart didn't race. It beat slow and even, as if her body had already decided this was the path forward. She forwarded the email to Freeman. Minutes later, Freeman called. "She's reputable and bold. I say we hear her out. Do you think there really is something sealed? If Alistair wrote even a word about you in his final documents, it changes everything. That afternoon, they met Rosalie over video. She was sharp without being sharp-tongued, spoke like someone who understood the weight of time and reputation. "These clauses are rare," she explained, "but not unheard of, especially in old families. Sometimes they conceal them to protect someone, or to protect themselves from the public knowing they cared." Mira tilted her head. "So he could have left something. Not money, just words." Rosalie nodded. "Exactly. Acknowledgement can be a legacy." Mira said nothing for a long time, then let's open it. The battle wasn't about ownership. It was about record, the record of a woman named Lena, the record of a girl who bore a man's last breath in her hands and had to bury him with questions he never answered. That night, Mira reread the original note. "Don't tell her I'm her father. Just make sure she gets here. I want to see her one last time." She whispered to the ceiling, "You almost made it right. Let me finish it." And somewhere miles away, the sealed words of a dead man waited, for light, for truth, for her. There was no grand courtroom, no marble columns, no raised benches. The meeting took place in a neutral room inside a private arbitration center nestled behind glass doors and quiet corridors just off Kensington High Street. It was discreet quiet by design and the sort of place where wealthy people went to settle family matters without press public records or reputations being smeared on the evening news. Mira had dressed simply, a navy blue sweater over a white button-down shirt, dark trousers, her hair combed and tied neatly back. She looked neither older nor younger than 12, just still. Freeman walked beside her, silent as a bodyguard. Rosalie, on Mira's other side, carried a slim leather portfolio and the expression of someone prepared to push through fire calmly. Across the table sat Margaret Anthony and an older man in a dark gray suit representing the Bennett estate. He didn't introduce himself, and no one asked. An arbitration officer, a woman with a clipped accent and a watchful gaze, welcomed everyone with formality but little warmth. She outlined the nature of the petition, an informal request for unsealing a sealed codicil in the late Alistair Bennett's last will and testament. The clause was only to be opened if direct lineage could be reasonably argued and represented. "We're not arguing for money," Rosalie said clearly. "We're asking for a reading." "What's the purpose?" Margaret's voice was sharp. Her fingers were laced together on the table. "Why dig up what's been laid to rest?" Because truth doesn't die when people do," Freeman replied, her tone steady. "It waits, sometimes for decades." The arbitrator turned to Mira. Her tone softened, but not condescending. "Do you understand why you're here, dear?" Mira nodded. Her hands rested in her lap. Her voice was soft, but not weak. "Because my name matters." There was a pause, the kind that asked everyone in the room to take the girl seriously. The arbitrator leaned back, reviewed a document in front of her, then looked at the sealed envelope marked with an embossed B. The signature across the flap was unmistakably Alistair's. Fluid, controlled, the signature of a man who had made his fortune building systems others feared to touch. By discretionary authority granted under Provision 32, the arbitrator said, "I will authorize the unsealing, with all parties present." Margaret shifted uncomfortably. The envelope was sliced open, inside a folded page, thick parchment, handwritten in dark ink. The arbitrator read aloud, "To whom this may concern. If this codicil is ever opened, it means I lack the courage to do what I should have done when I was breathing. There is a girl. Her name is Mira. She is my daughter. Her mother is Lena, who worked in my home and should have been treated better by everyone who walked those halls, including me. I arranged for Mira to come to this country because I wish to see her to understand who she is, even if I could never summon the nerve to tell her who I am. If she is reading this or hearing this, I ask for nothing except that she know the silence was never her fault. This statement does not alter the distribution of my estate. That has been decided for years. But it does, I hope, restore what was taken from her, the truth." There was no response for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't absence but reverence. Margaret's eyes were closed. Anthony stared at the table. Freeman glanced at Mira, who did not flinch. The arbitrator placed the document flat on the table. "This will be entered into the private record of the estate. Miss Mira may request a certified copy." "Thank you," Rosalie said, barely louder than a breath. Mira stood. Her knees felt strange, not weak, but weightless, like the gravity that had pinned her identity to secrecy was loosening. She didn't speak to the family, didn't look at them either. There was nothing to argue. This wasn't a triumph or a victory, just a return of voice, of name, of place. Outside in the hallway, Mira stopped. She turned to Freeman. He didn't hide because he hated me. No, he hid because he hated what he did. Freeman nodded. Rosalie handed Mira the original document, now in a protective sleeve. You keep it. It's not a legal asset, but it's yours. That evening, they returned to Freeman's apartment. Mira sat by the window watching people on the street walk home with shopping bags, coffee cups, conversations. Do I tell people now?" she asked. "You tell them what feels right," Freeman replied. Mira thought for a moment. "He didn't owe me money, just memory. And you have that now, some of it." Freeman walked over, set a mug of warm milk beside her. Mira took it slowly, hands wrapping around the cup. She sipped and stared out the window again. She whispered almost to herself, "I wonder what he thought when he saw me at the hospital. I wonder if he knew it was me." Freeman didn't answer. She knew some questions were meant to stay open. Mira didn't cry that night. She didn't write in her journal. She just sat by the window until the lights outside blurred into a quiet constellation of city life. Then slowly she folded the letter, placed it under her pillow, and climbed into bed. The next morning, a message appeared on Freeman's phone. A journalist at the Times wanted a quote. A family foundation donor had leaked the sealed clause. The public was now aware. "What do you want to do?" Freeman asked. Mira pulled the letter from under her pillow. She looked at it, then at Freeman. "Tell them I'm not angry. I'm just done being invisible." Freeman nodded. That Mira is something the world needs to hear. And for the first time in weeks, the girl smiled. It was almost dusk when the envelope arrived. Unmarked, slid beneath the heavy wooden door of the guest wing where Mira had been staying. It sat quietly on the patterned rug like a whisper waiting to be heard. The house around her had been too quiet all day, a kind of silence that felt staged, as if the walls themselves were withholding something. Mira stared at the envelope for a moment before picking it up with both hands, the paper thick and heavy, like it carried something it wasn't sure it should be delivering. Her name wasn't written on it. No stamp, no return address, just an old-fashioned wax seal already broken. Someone wanted her to find it. Inside were documents, not many, just a handful of crisp, high-grade sheets, one of which bore the header of Halford and Wessex LLP. Mira unfolded the first one slowly, her hands trembling, heart pacing, like it knew something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. It was a power of attorney dated months before her arrival in England. The name in the authorizing field read Alistair W. Bennett. Below that, in looping blue ink, his signature. Her eyes flicked down to the line marked Recipient of Authorized Assistance, and there was her full name printed neatly, unmistakably. Her breathing slowed. The second sheet was a printout of an email. The sender's name, Alistair Bennett. The recipient, Arthur Halford. The subject line was vague travel arrangements. But the message said everything. "Don't tell her I'm her father. Just make sure she gets here. I want to see her one last time." There were no flourishes, no apologies, no declarations of love or regret. Just a quiet plea. Mira sat still for a long moment. Her fingers grazed the paper again, as if touching the ink could somehow bring him closer. Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry yet. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even shock. It was a recognition, like finding a piece of a puzzle you'd already guessed was missing. One more sheet, a financial report with line items that made everything clear. A wire transfer for her plane ticket, a scholarship fund underwritten anonymously, monthly deposits for living expenses in a trust set up shortly after her mother died. He had taken care of her from afar. She clutched the envelope to her chest and stood up, walking to the window. The grounds looked deceptively peaceful. The legacy of a man who had built an empire, who had hidden a daughter from his name, now lived in her hands in paper and print. And yet, for the first time since she had stepped into this house, she didn't feel like an outsider. Not entirely. Rosalie, the younger associate from Halford's firm, arrived an hour later. She looked almost apologetic just entering the room. Mira held up the papers before the woman could say a word. "Did you know?" Mira asked. Rosalie sighed, lowered her gaze. "Only pieces. Halford handled most of it personally. He didn't even loop me in until the last will revisions." Mira sat the documents now splayed across the table, like cards waiting to be played. "So what does this mean?" she asked. Rosalie looked her in the eye, then sat across from her. "It means there's more. His final will, there's a sealed clause. Halford didn't want it unsealed unless it was legally compelled. But with this," she tapped the email, "you have standing to contest." "Contest what?" "Your exclusion." Mira blinked. "But I don't want the money. It's not about that anymore." Rosalie said gently. "It's about truth. If you challenge the estate, the clause opens. The court will demand it." That night, Mira paced her room with the documents in hand. Freeman came in quietly and sat beside her, watching her silently, like he had always done since her arrival. She finally asked, "Do you think he was afraid of me?" Freeman took his time before answering. "I think he was afraid of himself, of what he hadn't been, of what he couldn't fix." Mira nodded slowly. Then quietly she said, "But he tried. That's something." She didn't sleep much, but in the morning she was ready. Her voice didn't tremble when she told Rosalie to proceed. She sat through the paperwork, the legal jargon, the filing notices, and listened as the law started doing what people couldn't do on their own, force the truth into daylight. When the sealed clause was finally unwrapped by the probate judge a week later, it confirmed what she already knew, that Mira Lena Gaines was the biological daughter of Alistair William Bennett. That in the event of his death, should she come forward and identify herself, she was to be offered full acknowledgement as a member of the family with access to all heritage entitlements, not just financially, but historically. A seat at the table, her name to be recorded in the family's official genealogical register, and an option, not a requirement, to assume the Bennett name. Mira sat through the reading expressionless, but her fingers clutched the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles paled. She didn't look at the other family members seated at the far end of the courtroom. She didn't need to. Their silence was louder than any outburst. Later that day, she visited the family cemetery alone. Alistair's tombstone was pristine. No flowers, no offerings. Mira knelt down, pulling the scarf tighter around her shoulders, and said aloud, "I got the letter." She laid down the envelope, not because she forgave him, not because it made it all better, but because the truth, his truth, finally was hers now. She walked away with slow, steady steps, the winter wind brushing past her face, and for the first time in her 12 years, she felt seen. Not because a man wrote her into a clause, but because she had stood up and demanded the story be told right. The hearing day arrived with a weight that pressed on Mira's chest like a stone. The courtroom wasn't what she had imagined. It wasn't grand or terrifying, just a clean, quiet space with a few wooden benches, a high bench for the judge, and the muffled shuffles of papers. Mira wasn't meant to speak in front of everyone. The court had deemed her too young to testify formally, but her lawyer, Miss Redman, had arranged for a video statement to be played. Mira had recorded it the night before, sitting straight-backed in her modest guest room, speaking carefully into the camera. The court approved the method, respecting both her age and the significance of her words. Now, seated with her guardian beside her and Miss Redman ahead, Mira watched as the courtroom paused for the screen to flicker to life. Her face appeared on the screen, eyes wide, voice soft but unwavering. She said her full name, Mira Gaines, and then explained why she had come to this country, how she had found her mother's history hidden beneath years of silence, and why she believed the legacy of Alistair Wright was not about money or entitlement, but about truth. Her words were simple, but no less powerful because of it. "I just want to know I mattered," her voice echoed. "I want to know my mom wasn't nothing to him. I want to know I come from someone who could have cared. Maybe he was scared, but he tried. And that's something. That means something to me." The room remained still when the video ended. Mira kept her eyes down, fingers laced tightly. The judge offered a small nod, then turned to the barristers to proceed. It wasn't a criminal trial, but a hearing to assess claims around the Wright estate and whether Mira had standing to be acknowledged, not as an heir, but as the biological daughter of the deceased. The opposing counsel leaned on technicalities, questioning the validity of Alistair's intent, the timing of documents, even Mira's motivations. But every time Miss Redmond stood to speak, her presence carried a grounded authority that cut through the fog of objection. She laid out the sequence of bank transfers leading up to Mira's flight from the U.S. emails that revealed instructions from Alistair to his solicitor, "Ensure she gets here. Do not tell her the truth yet. I want to see her." Halford's firm initially denied these messages existed, but a junior associate had anonymously passed the correspondence to Mira's legal team. It was subtle sabotage, or perhaps conscience. Whatever it was, it changed everything. The judge requested a recess to review the contents. During the break, Mira stepped out into the hallway, her shoes making small sounds against the tile. Her guardian handed her a juice box and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said softly. She only nodded, feeling too old for juice, but too young for justice. The courthouse, with its muted colors and stiff air, felt like a place where adults talked about her life like it was a technical problem to solve. But at least now, someone had finally listened to her voice. When they were called back in, the judge delivered his summary. While the estate would remain under the administration of its trustees, the court acknowledged that Mira Gaines had been in fact the biological daughter of Alistair Wright. It wouldn't change inheritance laws. It wouldn't undo a childhood of not knowing. But it gave her something real, the truth in a legal record impossible to erase. Mira didn't smile. She didn't cry, but her jaw relaxed just slightly as if the muscles holding her together finally allowed her to exhale. Later, Miss Redmond bent down beside her and said, "This wasn't about money. It never was it?" Mira shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It was about her. And me." Outside the courtroom, the sky had turned a pale gray. Mira pulled her coat tighter, stepped into the wind, and walked toward the car waiting at the curb. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. What mattered was no longer behind her. The day after Mira's pre-recorded testimony was aired in court, a quiet ripple of reaction swept through the courtroom and beyond. The video hadn't needed elaborate production. It was a simple, clear shot of a 12-year-old girl sitting upright in a plain chair, wearing a navy cardigan, her hair neatly pulled back. But her voice, tremulous yet firm, and her steady gaze into the camera carried a truth that no jury, no matter how hardened or skeptical, could dismiss. Even the defense attorney, a man known for his sharp cross-examinations and skeptical tone, had nothing to contest. He sat still as the footage ended, lips drawn in a tight line, eyes lowered. Mira's statement wasn't theatrical. She didn't raise her voice or shed a tear for sympathy. She spoke as a child who had witnessed something horrific, processed it, and still chose to speak not to punish, but to make sure the truth would not be buried. "He fell," she had said of Alistair. "I tried to help. I pushed hard, just like they taught us at school. But when the other man came, he told me not to touch him. He said, 'Let nature finish the job.' And I didn't understand that. But now I think I do." There had been a pause. She had looked directly into the lens, and her small hand had touched her chest, right over her heart. "My mom said I had a right to exist, that even if people don't like how I look, I still matter. I believe that now. That's why I'm speaking." The jury had watched in silence. So had Alistair's sister Clarice, who had flown in just days before. She hadn't come for the will, nor for the press chaos building around the case. She came because she knew Mira's name. Because once long ago, Lena had left a message on her answering machine that began, "I just want someone to know she's here." Outside the courtroom, Mira sat in a waiting room beside Esther, her caseworker. They were coloring a simple butterfly sketch from a children's book. Mira had asked for crayons not to pass the time, but to steady her hands. She didn't want to cry. Not yet. Esther watched her quietly, occasionally reaching out to gently pat her back. "Will they believe me?" Mira asked without looking up. Esther replied softly, "They already do." In the weeks that followed, the trial pivoted heavily on Mira's testimony, the documentation from Alistair's private letters, and corroborating reports from Halford's own junior associates who, spurred by conscience, came forward. One paralegal produced an unredacted letter from Alistair confirming that Mira was his daughter and that he had intended to bring her over quietly. "Not for inheritance," the letter said, "but because I want her to know she came from something, even if I failed her mother. Even if I failed her." The prosecution built their final case not around greed or power struggles, but around the undeniable pattern of quiet prejudice. The slow, invisible erasure of a woman and her child from a family narrative, a will rewritten to exclude a mistress, silence through financial coercion, a child brought across an ocean with no acknowledgement of her origin. It was discrimination in the subtlest but deadliest of forms. Public interest soared, but the story never turned sensational. Mira's case was handled with rare care by the press, thanks in part to Clarice's insistence. She met with journalists and stated firmly, "This is not a scandal, it's a reckoning. If you're going to write about it, write it right." Meanwhile, Mira returned to her school routine in London. She rode the bus with headphones in, sat by the window in the cafeteria, and visited Esther once a week. The therapy helped, though some days she still didn't talk much, but she was steady. Steadier than anyone expected. One morning, a teacher found a small card on their desk in Mira's handwriting. It read, "Thank you for seeing me like I belong." Back in the courtroom, the verdict finally arrived. The opposition had attempted to discredit the documents and testimony, but the facts were too strong. The judge ruled the will's revision invalid due to coercion and misrepresentation, recognizing Mira as the legitimate heir. Halford the lawyer was sanctioned, and an investigation into professional misconduct began. Clarice offered Mira a seat on the board of the Wright Foundation to be held for her when she came of age. For now, Clarice herself would act as temporary steward, but under the moral guidance of Lena's story and Mira's voice. When Esther told Mira the outcome, they were sitting on a park bench watching pigeons. Mira blinked, then looked up at the clouds. "Does that mean it's over?" Esther shook her head. "Not over, but maybe lighter." Mira nodded, her fingers curled around the edge of the bench. "I want to visit her, where she was, where she lived, the room, the window." Esther smiled. "We can do that, together." The day they went back to the estate, Mira walked through the halls silently. She paused by the stairway where a woman once fell in silence. She stood by the window where a young mother had once looked out, longing for escape, and she whispered, "I see you now." This was not a story of revenge. It was not even one of pure justice. It was a girl's quiet declaration that truth matters, that even in a world built on silence and shadows, a child's voice could ring clear and shift the course of the powerful. And as Mira stood in the room where her mother once cried alone, she did not cry. She placed her hand on the wall, let the afternoon sun touch her skin, and smiled. "I made it, Mama." The judge's gavel had barely settled into silence when Mira stepped off the courtroom threshold and back into the hallway that no longer felt like a corridor of intimidation. It now held the soft echo of justice. For the first time in weeks, the 11-year-old girl walked without keeping her arms tightly pinned to her sides. Her guardian, Mrs. Collier, walked beside her, slower this time, letting Mira set the pace, her face tender with quiet pride. Behind them, the sound of shuffling papers and murmurs faded as the court emptied. It was over, but the weight on Mira's chest wasn't gone, not completely. What she had achieved was real, but so was the ache. She had hoped perhaps in some small, impossible part of her heart that Alistair Wright would be there in the end, alive, facing her, saying something, anything. Instead, she had a name on a document in a cold gravestone. Later that evening, in a small chapel garden behind the courthouse, Mira stood alone in front of a memorial plaque. Not for Alistair, for Lena Gaines. The lawyer Halford had arranged for a quiet installation after reviewing the original birth record and her final statement, once hidden in archives. The plaque read, "Lena Gaines, beloved mother, brilliant pianist. She loved fiercely and left quietly." Mira traced each letter with her fingers slowly, as if anchoring them to memory. She wasn't crying, but her throat burned with a thickness she couldn't swallow away. She whispered, "He didn't save you, Mama, but I will make sure they remember." The estate battle had left the Wright family legacy tarnished publicly. Several board members resigned. The media, previously polite to the empire, started questioning its history. But Mira, through the help of Mrs. Collier and her legal team, declined any financial inheritance. Instead, she requested the creation of a foundation, the Lena Fund for Music and Justice, providing scholarships to young women of color in underfunded neighborhoods who wanted to study classical piano or law. Halford surprisingly agreed to assist pro bono, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of decency, finally awakened. 1 week later, Mira returned to the Wright estate, not as a guest, not as a child looking for answers, but as someone laying things to rest. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ashcroft, opened the door. This time, no hesitation, no furrowed brow of suspicion, just a soft, "Miss Gaines, would you like to see the music room again?" Mira nodded. She stepped inside the grand room where sunlight struck the ivory keys in bands of gold. The Steinway was polished, silent. She sat on the bench, small legs not quite touching the floor, and opened the lid. Her fingers hovered. Then she played, not a full piece, just the first few bars of the lullaby her mother used to hum when sweeping the floor of their old apartment. Her touch was tentative, but true. A housekeeper paused in the hallway. Another stood at the far door. No one spoke. When she stopped, Mira didn't turn around. She simply said it was hers before it was ever theirs. The next morning, Mira left England. At the airport, she clutched a worn paperback, her mother's favorite book. On the inside cover was an old train ticket stub, faded handwriting, "Remember, little bird, your voice matters." Mira read it 3 times during the flight. Back in her neighborhood, school resumed. Kids whispered, some stared. A few teachers pulled her aside with awkward grace, saying they were so proud of how brave she had been. Mira didn't explain. She didn't want to relive it for them. Not yet. But she started a school club called Echo, encouraging students to write letters to people who had changed their lives. She wrote one herself. "Dear Mom, I know now why you kept quiet, why you sang to me instead of speaking names. I forgive you. You weren't weak. You were tired. But I won't be. Not for a long time. Your name is safe with me. Love, Mira." The final scene wasn't about courts or pianos or plaques. It was Mira walking past a local park where a new mural had just been finished. Bright, wide brushstrokes of a black woman playing piano, her daughter sitting beside her, notebook in hand. Beneath it, one line, "Justice is remembering." Mira stopped. She smiled, and then she kept walking. And that is the end of this story. If you've stayed with us through every breath, every injustice, and every moment of quiet strength, thank you. Your time, your presence, your willingness to feel deeply with these characters. It means everything. This wasn't just a story about family or legacy. It was about dignity, about truth, about the quiet courage it takes to stand up and say, "I matter." If something in Mira's journey stirred something in you, anger, hope, maybe even tears, I invite you to share that below. Let your voice join hers. I'd love to know what part stayed with you, what made you pause, what gave you peace. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? It's always a beautiful thing to see how far stories like these can travel. From one heart to another, across oceans and across time zones. We'll return soon with more stories that search for justice, speak from the soul, and never rush to resolution. But until then, know this: your support makes every line worth writing. I'm deeply grateful you're here. See you in the next story.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.